Lots of people complain about how early it gets dark this time of year. Imagine if you lived in the northern tip of Alaska, above the Arctic Circle. If you think it gets dark early in Myrtle Beach this time of year, you haven't seen anything. There are places in northern Alaska where the sun sets in mid-November and doesn't rise again until late January. For example, in Barrow, Alaska, the sun doesn't rise for 67 days around the time of the winter solstice. Is any wonder why they have drinking problems in life? When the sun does rise, the whole town comes out to celebrate. Plus, finally, there's light again. The prophet Isaiah wrote in the 60th chapter of Isaiah, "Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee." He was not speaking to the citizens of Barrow, Alaska. He was talking about the revealing of Jesus Christ to the world. He was describing what the season of Epiphany is all about. It is a season where the Son of God reveals his glory to the world. And during the next few weeks, our services will revolve around the light that's been turned on. God has told us through the words of the great prophet Isaiah, "Arise, shine, for the light is come," he said, "and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee." Now, among the first to bear witness to this spectacular event were wise men from the east, as was described in today's gospel lesson. The story of the Magi is certainly a mystical, complicated one at best. As you can see, we've added the wise men to our manger scene today. There's not a lot particularly known about what happened. If you notice the words in the gospel today, it said they came to worship the child in a house, which means that apparently this has taken place now sometime after the birth of Jesus. They've moved away from this cave-like structure that Jesus was born in into a house of some kind. We don't know how long. They're all, theological scholars have all kinds of concepts about how this happened. Some weeks, months, even years after the birth of Christ this could have occurred. The important thing is, it did occur. These men were indeed curious travelers now following the star. Imagine, if you will, this huge caravan appearing in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was not a large place, to say the least. So in addition to the wise men, there were probably a couple of hundred others in this entourage. And you'd have porters and manservants and cooks and camel keepers and all kinds of mercenaries for protection. Believe me, they created a lot of royal attention when they arrived in Bethlehem. Especially when they mentioned that they had come to worship the King of Jews. Now, can you imagine old Herod's response to this? Whoa, wait a minute, fellas. You better understand, I'm the only king around here, and that means that I'm king of the goats, the sheep, the Romans, and the Jews. I'm the one. But old Herod was also a very crafty politician. And so the first thing he says, listen, why don't you fellas seek out this king, and then let me know just exactly where he is, so I can pay my respects as well. Scriptures tell us that these wise men were warned by God of Herod's real intent in a dream, and of course after worshiping the Christ child and presenting him with gifts, they departed back from whence they came, choosing, the Scriptures tell us, a different way from which they originally came. We don't know much about these men. The Bible really doesn't mention them by name. They were actually named around the 9th century by one of the church councils. Everest is described as Caspar, an aged white-bearded man supposedly from Tarsus. Melchior, a middle-aged king from Arabia, and Balthazar, a dark young king from Sheba. But these men were very special for this reason. they fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah where he said, they shall bring gold and incense, and they shall show forth praises of the Lord. These wise men were called Magi. That name, Magi itself, first only appeared in history about the 7th century before Christ in the Median Empire. It's possible that we see examples of such mysterious men in the 2nd chapter of Daniel and again in the 39th chapter of Jeremiah. At the time of the birth of Jesus, they were more than likely part of an ancient priestly caste dwelling within the Parthian Empire that practiced astrology. And at that time, astrology was a hybrid of astrology and what we now call astronomy. They were supposed to be very adept at interpreting dreams, but they also had a very unique characteristic. They were able to accomplish God's purpose because, you see, these men were very serious seekers. I mean, you don't start off across the great deserts of the world traveling in unknown countries with a huge entourage of people that required an awful lot of pre-planning without being a serious seeker of something. As my wife well knows, when I go away for long fishing trips or hiking expeditions, our house is cluttered with all of the preparation. I have lists that I go by. You don't want to get caught up in the middle of the Appalachian Trail without matches or a fire starter and it rains or cold or whatever. I'm not Bear Grylls, much as I'd like the guy. So they took a lot of preparation. These men were serious about what they were doing. Now, most of us, when it comes to being a serious seeker of God, fall into one of two categories. We're either satisfied and comfortable with who we are in our relationship with God, and when that happens, that's a very dangerous circumstance because we tend to get very complacent about our faith. Or we are seeking a better relationship with our Savior. See, I'm not sure that anyone, and I can tell you this for myself for sure, I'm not sure that anyone is ever completely satisfied with his relationship with God. I believe that for most of us, our spiritual lives are works in progress. That's why we study the scriptures. That's why we contemplate on who we really are and constantly self-examine our lives to make sure that we're the very best we can be in our relationship with Jesus Christ. You see, those are marks of serious seekers. These wise men took a lot of time to investigate this mysterious star. For them, this was a long journey, long period of travel time. But they were very serious because they had this message, they had this desire, they had this longing, this pointing to God. And all of us as serious Christians have to be diligent in our efforts to learn, to explore, to seek. Many people feel that, well, just because they go to church on a regular basis, their spiritual quest has been fulfilled. Listen. Spiritual fulfillment is a lifelong experience. If you're a serious seeker, you will never be satisfied with status quo religion. If your idea is simply filling up the same pew every Sunday morning, my friend, you're coming up short. If you have a real passion about your relationship with Jesus Christ, then you will need to find out more and a need to grow in your relationship to God. You know, many people think they have a relationship with God. They think they have religion. Many say they understand God's plan to save the world, and yet they have no real passion for Jesus Christ. God's constantly calling us, sometimes through other people, sometimes through adversity, sometimes through miracles. God speaks to all of us in many different kinds of ways, and we have to be willing to learn, to listen, to be prepared to receive His prompting. And to do that, we have to be active seekers. You know, it's almost like turning on a radio or a television set. Now, I don't have to tell you how important it is if we have hurricane warnings down here to turn on your weather radio or watch the television news to find out what's just going on. But you got to start turning on the switch, or in most cases, the remote control. As serious seekers, we turn on the switch by opening our hearts and minds to God. Max Lucado, the great Christian writer, said if there are 1,000 steps between us and God, He will take all but one. He will leave the final one for us. We have to choose. Prophet Jeremiah said, "And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all of your heart." Now, we've just gone through a long season of Advent and Christmas, and find ourselves now at Epiphany. This has been a long journey, a spiritual journey. What does all of that mean? There's a deep meaning far beyond the Christmas trees, the presents, the parties, the worship service. What does this really mean? Well, why did this have to happen? What happened in that cave in Bethlehem? Why did God send His Son into this world? After all, He's God. There's something unusual about that. I'll tell you a wonderful story I read not long ago. The pastor of a small congregation who had visited this old farmer from time to time in an attempt to share the gospel with him. And each time the farmer would tell the pastor, he said, listen, I believe in God. He said, it's impossible not to believe in God when you look around the beauty of this earth and the way in which life is created. It's just Jesus I don't understand. He said, why would a perfect and all-powerful God have to come down as a man and then die just to make things right? Well, pastor ever able to answer that question quite satisfactorily. Then one night as the farmer was sitting in his living room during a very heavy snowstorm, he heard a thump on the window. And then there was another thump. And he looked out, but he couldn't see more than a few feet because of the snowstorm. When the snow let up a little bit, he ventured outside to see what it could have been beating on his window. And in the field near his house, he saw a flock of wild geese. Apparently, they had been flying south for the winter, and when they got caught in the snowstorm, they simply could not go on any further. They were lost and stranded on his farm with no food and no shelter. They just flapped their wings and flew around the field in low circles, and blindly and aimlessly. And a couple of them apparently had flown into his window. Well, the man felt sorry for the geese, and he wanted to help them, so he thought that his barn would be a great place for them to stay. That it's warm and safe, and surely they could spend the night out of the storm. So he walked over the barn, opened the doors wide, and watched and waited, hoping that the open barn door would attract him. But the geese just fluttered around aimlessly and didn't seem to notice the barn or realize what it could mean for them. The man tried to get their attention, but that just seemed to scare them, and they moved further away. He went into the house and came back with some bread and broke it up into little pieces and made a trail leading to the barn, but they still didn't catch on. Now he was really getting frustrated. He got behind them and tried to shoo them towards the barn, and they only got more scared and scattered in every direction except towards the barn. Nothing he could do would get those geese into the barn. So he asked himself the question, why don't they follow me? He said, I can't understand this. Can't they understand that this is the only safe place in which they could survive this storm? He thought for a moment. And he said, if I were only a goose, I could save them. So he had an idea. Went to the barn and got one of his own geese and carried it in his arms, circled around behind the flock of geese and released his goose, and it flew, of course, through the flock and straight into the barn, and then one by one, the other geese fell in line and followed his goose into the barn to safety. He stood there silently for a moment as the words he had spoken earlier replayed in his mind. If I were only a goose, I could save him. And he thought about what he had said to his preacher earlier. Why would God want to be like us? That's ridiculous. Suddenly it all made sense. That's what God has done. You know, we were like the geese, blind, lost, perishing, and God has sent his Son among us to become like us so that he could show us the way and save us. That, he thought, is the real meaning of Christmas. That's why this child was brought into the world. And suddenly he understood. And years of doubt and disbelief vanished. And he fell to his knees and smiled and prayed his first prayer. You and I must be serious seekers. And I pray that during this new year that you will make a commitment to being a serious seeker, just as those wise men from the east. Mustn't be intimidated by the length or the complexity of the journey. We have to be a serious seeker because ultimately every serious seeker